My guests today are Amy Wood and Greg Belliston. Amy is a partner of Cooley down in San Diego, where she is chair of the firm's compensation and benefits practice group. Amy has been a fixture at my annual proxy season conference and is one of the nicest people I know. Greg is assistant general counsel and assistant corporate secretary at Nu Skin out in Provo, Utah. Greg is like me, someone who has done the trifecta of practicing in this area: government, a former SEC staffer in Corp Fin, who then had some nice years at a law firm, Gibson Dunn, before going in-house. Greg is deeply involved in working with the compensation arrangements for the Nu Skin executives, so his viewpoint here is invaluable. I'm Brock Romanak, today on Zippy Point. So, Amy and Greg, thanks for joining us and talking about the grant-based table. It's such an exciting table, as we're about to find out. And we're going to start by just literally going through the table. So why don't we start and go column by column here through the grant of plan-based awards table. And obviously you have the name of the executive officers, and there is a separate Vid-Guide on how do you determine who your named executive officers are. So we do not need to cover that column. What about the grant date column?
Yeah, so we'll start with the grant date. The grant date column's pretty straightforward. What I would note that may not be straightforward, if the approval date of the award is not the grant date of the award, then you'll be adding an additional column for the approval date. So you may see some tables that have a grant date column and an approval date column, but if your approval date is the same as the grant date, then you'll just need that grant date column. And then
and I would just note that this is only required for equity awards, right? For non-equity awards, you can just leave it blank or put NA.
Yeah, that's a great point, Greg. And I guess kind of big picture, because this table is going to cover all types of incentive awards. So it's going to be your equity incentive awards, and it's going to be your non-equity incentive plan awards. So it's usually going to pick up a bonus program, maybe a long-term cash incentive program, and then equity awards as well. After the grant date, that's where we will move over next to the estimated future payouts under non-equity incentive plan awards. So this is going to be performance-based bonuses of any performance period. It might be your annual, it might be longer if you have a multi-year long-term cash incentive program, or it could even be shorter than 1 year. And this calls for the threshold, target, and maximum amount. If that's not how your program or plan is structured, you don't have to force a threshold, target, or maximum amount. You can just leave that blank, and then in the footnote, describe the terms of the program and why you are not including a threshold or maximum amount. And then if we move over to the estimated future payouts under the equity incentive plan awards, so this will be your performance-based equity awards. And same thing here, this calls for the threshold, target, and maximum if applicable. And these columns call for the number of shares. So you're putting in the number of shares here, and same thing if you don't have if the award's not structured to have that range and a fixed threshold, target, maximum, you can put the number of shares into the target and then not include anything for threshold or maximum, and just include a description in the footnote of why those cells will be blank. And then once we get through our performance-based comp, then we move over to all other stock awards. And this will be the number of shares. This is for time-based equity awards, and you'll be including the number of shares in this column. And then the last column after you include the number of shares is the accounting grant date value. It's the grant date value of the award. The other thing that we should talk about here is that not only do grants that take place during the year go in this table, but if you have a modification of any of the awards that are covered in this table, then the modification also needs to be disclosed in the grants of plan-based awards table. That's something that sometimes gets missed. But any award that's modified goes into this table. So with the last column, the grant date value, for your equity awards. If you have a modification, then there's additional guidance on how you determine the accounting value of that modification for that last column.
And I would just emphasize that in this last column, you're really following your accounting team's lead on this, that it is the accounting value that you're required to report. And there's a CDI that illustrates this. It's Reg SK CDI number 120.06. And it gives the example of an award with 3 single-year performance periods. And it asks, how do you determine the grant date fair value to report for that award? And the answer is you follow the accounting rules. If all of the terms, or enough of the terms are set up front such that there is a grant date for the entire award, all 3 tranches, then that's the amount you're going to put in the column. But if, for example, the targets for those years 2 and 3 aren't going to be set until the beginning of years 2 and 3, you don't have a grant date for those tranches yet, and you don't, so you're going to report a smaller number in your table for year 1. So whatever the accounting rules lead to as far as the grant date fair value, that's the number that you're taking.
And one other question sometimes just in the table format occasionally arises, there is a CDI on point, is can you change the column heading if you're disclosing only annual awards and they've already been earned? So the heading in the form is estimated future payouts under non-equity incentive plan awards. And the question is, if the awards have already been earned, can we change that heading? Because that's just too hypothetical. And the CDI says, yes, we can change that heading. So it's subtle, but you can change it. If the awards were made in the same year they're earned, then you can change it and you can call it estimated possible payouts under non-equity incentive plan awards. You still have to, what it doesn't let you do is disclose only what actually happened. You still have to give that whole range in terms of what it was at the time of grant. But instead of saying estimated future payouts, you can say estimated possible payouts.
So, and then that grant date fair value, that's also the number that's going to carry over into the summary comp table in the stock award or option award column as applicable.
Yeah, and I think that's a good tip. That's especially kind of the process of working on the proxy and updating the tables. I think there's a lot of sort of drill down real deep on one area and then to remember, well, what is that tied to? And if I change something here, where else does it need to change? That's something that for whatever reason, oftentimes late in the process, there's the disconnect between the summary comp table and the grants of plan-based award table value of the grant date value of the equity where it should match. So that's just kind of on the checklist of things to make sure that at the end you're cross-checking the grants of plan-based award table and summary comp table. And then of course, all of this you're checking with the, cross-checking with the CD&A and making sure that if you make a change in one place, you're accurately updating the table or the CD&A to conform to the other.
Sure. Yeah, so there's our disclosure. One thing to point out is that we don't use time-based options, so we've omitted the column, that all other option awards column, that normally would be the third column from the right. But yeah, then you can see for the cash awards, we've put NA for the grant date. I don't really have a whole lot more to highlight on our proxy statement.
And these footnotes are obviously standard footnotes that are required by the table.
Yeah, just they really kind of just, they're definitional about threshold, target, and maximum. And I think we state that the grant date fair value is calculated per the accounting rules. Nothing really complicated in the footnotes there. Just providing some additional background and details on the awards.
Greg, one thing I like in your table though, and in the proxy disclosure is you do have a header for the narrative to the summary comp table and grants of plan-based awards table, which in addition to the table that we were looking at, the rule does also require narrative to both the summary comp table and grants of plan-based award table. It requires you to describe in narrative form the material factors necessary to an understanding of the information disclosed in the table. And this is something that I think often gets missed, or sometimes it goes in any number of places. I think your proxy does a really nice job putting it sort of in the place that it's most called for, and supplementing. I like the header so that we can say, okay, this is the narrative disclosure that's called for by the rule. And then you've added here some of the things that are called for by the rule that aren't disclosed elsewhere, that would be material to understanding what's disclosed in those tables. So the rule itself once calls for material terms of employment agreements, any material modification of an equity award during the year, the material terms of any award that's disclosed in the grants of plan-based awards table, including a description of the formula or the criteria applied to determine the amounts in the vesting schedule, an explanation of the amount of salary and bonus in proportion to total compensation. Some of that's going to be disclosed elsewhere and close enough. And so if you, I think practically you don't see 3 pages of disclosure in the narrative to the Summer Compatible Grants Plan-Based Awards table, that wouldn't help. But the most material things and that aren't disclosed right nearby should be there in narrative form by the tables.
So Greg, what diligence and data do you need to collect in advance to fill out the table?
Well, the first thing, the main thing I rely on is the comp committee minutes. All this stuff is required to be approved by the comp committee. At my company, it's all approved by the comp committee, all these grants to executive officers. So really almost everything that I need for this table is right in the minutes. That's where I can find the amounts and other details of each award. That's where I can get each executive officer's target bonus amount. And then our, all the percentages that I need to calculate the threshold and maximum amounts from that. The other couple things that I use in compiling this table are, I get a report from our stock plan administrator with all of the grants from the previous year, and that's a good check to make sure I've covered everything. And it also has a couple things that are not in the minutes, such as the grant date and the exercise price. The minutes will typically just say the exercise price is the closing stock price on the grant date. But to get the actual dollar value, that's captured in the stock plan administrator's database and report. And I get the grant date fair value by just directly reaching out to the accountants. I ask them to tell me that number, and they get back to me. So that's the diligence and data that I use in compiling the table.
Amy, do you see other companies do anything differently?
When I do, it might be relying on only one of those 2 sources, and I think getting both sources is good practice. So I think if sometimes it may be that the not either having access or not reviewing the comp committee minutes and looking just at the report from the stock administrator, I think that can leave room for error and leave room for things to come up later in the process when we're maybe focusing more on CD&A, or when the worst case, maybe the comp committee's reviewing it and something's a little off. So I think that tip of making sure to look at the minutes early in the process as well as will save missteps later.
Yeah, and you hope that normally when they're inputting things into the data, the database for the awards, they're relying on the minutes. So hopefully they're in agreement there. But being paranoid lawyers, we always want to check on the back end too when we're using the report to prepare the table and make sure it's all in agreement.
So you both have mentioned some common areas where mistakes could be made. Is there anything we haven't discussed about those are tricky areas where people have to watch out for?
Well, my first piece of advice for this table is to read the rule every year when you're preparing this disclosure, rather than just relying on your roll forward of last year's disclosure, because there are some things in the rule, some details that might not have applied last year but might apply this year. For example, as Amy mentioned, if the accounting grant date is different from the date when the comp committee took action to make the award, you need to add a column to the table to state the date that the comp committee took action. That might have not have been the case last year. Maybe last year those dates were one and the same, and this year they're different. So you really just need to read the rule to catch issues like that. A couple things about non-equity awards are, first, just make sure you're correctly distinguishing between bonuses and non-equity awards. And the details of how to do that are beyond the scope of what we're covering today. But chances are, if you've got a non-equity award that you incorrectly classify as a bonus in your summary comp table, there's a good chance you're going to miss it and fail to include it in this table as well. And then I think the other things I had in mind were covered. As Amy said, you can change the column heading from future to possible in the non-equity columns if everything is granted and earned in the same year. So those are the main things that come to mind for me.
I think that's such good advice to read the rule for everything probably, but especially this table every year, because this is there. I think that's where the gotchas are. If you just bring forward last year's, also that would help avoid the situation where you have a modification in 1 year. That's probably not going to happen every year. So maybe last year there were maybe the last 5 years there were no modifications, but this year there were modification to one or more of the awards. That is something that's picked up by the grants of plan-based awards table. So reading the rules would remind you of that. And then just building on the kind of broader advice. I know we've touched on this a bit already, but just making sure that you're regularly cross-checking where there's overlap to the summary comp table, in particular with this one, with the grants of plan-based awards table, for things like how you're characterizing bonus versus non-equity incentive plan compensation, and then also the CD&A. So you want to just make sure that those three things are tying in, both the characterization, for instance, with the bonus, also the footnotes. So the way that you're describing vesting in the footnotes, is that in sync with how you're describing it in the CD&A? And sometimes you'll have different people working on different sections all at the same time. And so there just needs to be someone who's focused on making sure that there's consistency throughout.
So how much do investors care about this table, Amy?
I would say this is one they care about a lot, because combination of this table and the CD&A. So this table being all about what did you grant in the most recent year, being the primary and prime subject of the say on pay vote. So this is the meat of it. This is, what did you grant? What was the range? What could have happened? What was the comp committee's decision-making process? This is, while it's the meat of it, this is more the hard, cold facts. The CD&A is going to describe the how and why, but there is investor attention, proxy advisory firm attention on this table, I would say. Also, for instance, ISS is going to calculate its own value of your performance awards. They're not going to necessarily just they're not going to take your accounting value. So they're going to get the information they need to do their own valuations from this table. They're going to look at your performance awards. They're going to look at your target number of shares here and then multiply by stock price. That's their valuation. So they're pulling data from this table that they need. And other investors are, if they're particularly focused on a certain aspect of your grant, whether it's the size or the vesting terms, they might drill down on this table as well.
And Greg, where would you rate this table on the fun scale, between a low, medium, or high, compared to the other tables? I know they're all
yeah,
high. They're all
very
high.
relative, right? I think this is an interesting one. I'd put it right up there near the top, because this is where the action was during the previous year. You're disclosing the grants, especially, or if there was a modification or a special one-time grant. Those are things that are going to get some attention. So I love doing this table. It's a party to prepare this table.
Nice. Well, thank you all so much. Thank you, Greg and Amy.
Thank you.